Welcome to the introduction of comparison and contrast. Although comparison and contrast are seldom used entirely by themselves, often being combined with other rhetorical patterns in the same essay, you have used them yourself while others have used them to make things clear to you. When you were a child, you might have asked your father what a giraffe was. His response might have been something like this: "It is an animal that looks something like a horse, except that it has long legs and a very long neck, much longer than a horse's neck. Its color is much like a leopard's, yellow with black spots, but the giraffe's spots are larger and he has fewer of them than a leopard has. A giraffe has a black tongue, too, very different from cats and dogs and most other animals." Your father answered your question by comparing and contrasting the giraffe's size, legs, neck color, and tongue with those of other animals. Because the giraffe is an animal, the best things to compare it with are other animals, members of the same classification. It would be possible to compare the giraffe to a Chevy. The giraffe is taller, not a machine, and a different color. It lacks bucket seats and a vinyl roof. We could even compare a giraffe to a telephone pole, but the comparisons and contrasts possible would not be as useful as the animal comparisons are in giving a child an idea of what a giraffe is. In general, then, we usually compare and contrast things in a group or class defined by our interest, or things that have important similarities as well as differences. There are three reasons for developing an essay by comparison and contrast. The first is that we might want to describe or define one item, and we do so by relating it to another item with which our reader is familiar. If you want to tell your reader how the Texas Senate operates, you might do it by comparing and contrasting the Texas Senate with the United States Senate. You assume that your reader knows something about the U.S. Senate and that he will be able to make the correct association with the Texas Senate. Obviously, it is important to choose one item with which your reader is already familiar. Comparing the Texas Senate to England's Parliament will not do much good if your reader has no idea how the Parliament operates. The second reason for developing an essay by comparison and contrast is to tell your reader something about both of the subjects by discussing them in relation to some general principle. The general principle should be applicable in both and familiar to the reader. So if your reader is not familiar with the Texas Senate or England's Parliament, you could compare and contrast them both by relating them to principles of democratic government that your reader understands. You might begin by showing that both the Texas Senate and England's Parliament use forms of representative government. The people elect representatives to these legislative bodies, and the elected legislators make laws on behalf of the electorate. Here you can compare the Texas Senate and England's Parliament in relation to representative government. Because our reader understands how representative government works, the people elect representatives to the legislative body, he now knows something about the Texas Senate and England's Parliament. Finally, you may compare and contrast several things with which the reader is already familiar in order to help him understand some general principles or ideas with which he is not familiar. If you want your reader to understand what government is, you might compare and contrast American democracy, British parliamentary rule, and the emerging Russian system to show what they have in common. If you want your reader to get an idea of what social science is, you can compare and contrast the academic disciplines of psychology, history, and economics to show what they have in common. In these cases, you would be using comparison and contrast to move from your examples, with which the reader is already familiar, American democracy and psychology, to a general description of the classes under which your examples belong, government or social science, about which your reader knows very little or nothing. Once you decide to use comparison and contrast, there are two basic ways of organizing your essay. You can present one item fully and then discuss the other, called the block method, or you can present a part of one item, then a part of the other, and so on until both are fully demonstrated, which is called the alternating method. Stay tuned for our next video, where we take a closer look at the block method.